Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I do a best of one, best of three meta review. So we're going to be talking about the top performing decks in the first week of Duskmourn. And first up, we've got Boros Auras. And this one looks to be the top performer, at least in week one. It is at least a standard deviation above the others. So I think this one is looking particularly strong and would probably be my recommended craft if you're looking for a deck. What I do is I use a tracker called Untapped, which is a third-party tracker that was over 300,000 matches. It just an obscene amount of data from everybody playing and using the tracker. So it's a good way for me to remove my bias and kind of just go off of what is working for the most amount of people from Bronze to Mythic. So keep that in mind. So this one is number one, and Boros Auras is a new archetype. So it's got the core of mono red. It's got the Manifold Mouse, the Emberheart Challenger, and the Heartfire Hero, as well as the Monstrous Rage and the Demonic Ruckus. So we've seen this before, and we're bringing in some white for Sheltered by Ghosts is insane. Okay, being able to remove your opponent's early play gives +1/+0 and lifelink, and then ward 2. So this card single-handedly destroys mono red. And then we've got Feather of Flight, which gives the creature +1/+0 and draws a card. We've got the Shard Mage's Rescue, which allows this deck to kind of play like the Gruul Aggro that we see more commonly in best of 3, so that you can protect your threats from removal. The Optimistic Scavenger makes it so that every time that you're playing one of these enchantments, and remember, Monstrous Rage does create an enchantment, you can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. If you put it on Heartfire Hero, you get 2. Just really, really great synergies. And the Ethereal Armor here then for the finishing blow on a double striking mouse, on even just a really big lifelink creature from the Sheltered by Ghosts, pushes an incredible amount of damage. And then Atali's Favor is in here for everything except for the Monstrous Rage, and it is a permanent. So you've got a really high chance that you're going to roll well off of the Discover 3, and then it also gives your creature trample. There was a second version that was in the tracker that was not running the Thran portals, and it was doing substantially less well. So especially because you have the lifelink off of Sheltered by Ghosts, we can play the Thran portals, and it helps us have the one red mana on turn 1 as well as 1 white mana on turn 1, which is very important for this deck. And the other thing that I like to do is throughout the weeks kind of track it, so this will be establishing the baseline for this archetype, and I also like to go over the matchups. So this deck is favored against Azorius Oculus or Azorius Mentor, Mono Red Aggro, and Golgari Midrange. It's a bit of a coin flip against the Rakdos Aggro turn 2 Leyline deck that I covered earlier last week. It kind of depends on who goes first, because if you can get the Sheltered by Ghosts down to remove their threat, it's over. But if they go first, you don't really have a single point interaction that you can do at instant speed on their turn 2 with 1 mana. So if they do pull off the combo with the 4-piece combo that we'll talk about here shortly, this deck doesn't have an answer to it. So it's kind of who has the play against Rakdos Aggro, and then it's weak against mono black discard. Next up is Azorius Oculus, and this one's number 2 according to Untapped, and this one's also a new archetype. So a good core of it is the mono blue tempo core that was putting things in your graveyard for the Haughty Djinn, and then running the Abhorrent Oculus. And we've seen the Mentor being played here, was being explored as well, and running the Oculus instead of the Djinn, and this one is running both and has been performing the best, at least according to the tracker. You have the 6 reanimation spells of Helping Hand and the 2 recommissions to be able to get your Haughty Djinn out and your Oculus out. If you are reanimating from the graveyard, then you can get around having to cast the Oculus from your hand. And then we have a whole bunch of things that just slow their tempo down. So the Soul Partition, into the Floodmaw, and then Disruption through the counterspells, Phantom Interference, 3 steps ahead, Cycling with the Sleight of Hand, Moment of Truth gets stuff into your graveyard so that you can increase the power of Djinn, and the Chart a Course does that as well. Being able to discard off of the Chart a Course is not bad in this archetype. And then we have the Mill off of Picklock Prankster. So I've tried out this deck before. We got the Abhorrent Oculus, and I'm really excited to see how this one, try this one out once I craft the Mythic. Oh, so as far as the matchups go, this one's favored against Mono Black discard, and it's still early on in the format to really say some of it's low data, so we'll know more further on into the set. If you have any questions, always feel free to ask me in the comments below. So it's weak to Rakdos Aggro, and you could bring in Elspeth's Smite as a way to kind of help out in this archetype. Same with the Ifara's Dispersal. And so this list is not running that, which is just accepting the fate against being poor against Rakdos Aggro. And interestingly, Into the Floodmaw hasn't performed as well, partially I think because of people bouncing the Leyline back to their hand instead of the creature. And because if you do the creature, they don't get the 1/1. And like Rakdos Aggro, if you're spending your turn 1 to bounce their Leyline and give them the 1/1, you are setting yourself up for a tough match. It's not unwinnable, but I do think that's why we see Into the Floodmaw performing worse than the other two options. So keep that in mind. If you are coming up against a lot of Rakdos Aggro, you might want to think about running Elspeth's Smite or Ifara's Dispersal to kind of help that matchup. Number 3 is Rakdos Aggro, and we talked about this archetype quite a bit during Bloomburrow. So this one, since we have enough to kind of compare it, well, let's talk about what changed since Bloomburrow. We dropped 1 copy of the Emberheart Challenger, dropped the 4 copies of the Mirren Banesplitter, which is the equipment for 1 red, dropped the 2 copies of the Blazing Crescendo, as well as all 3 copies of the Demonic Ruckus. And this is largely because we're bringing in the Leyline of Resonance, which needs to be an instant or sorcery, so it doesn't work as well with the Demonic Ruckus and the Mirren Banesplitter. And we're also just kind of lowering the curve. You can see here 17 lands. So we're bringing in Might of the Meek, which allows us to draw a bunch of cards, especially when it's getting copied off of the Leyline of Resonance. And then also the Turn Inside Out. And the importance of Turn Inside Out is for Cacophony Scamp. If you have a Cacophony Scamp on the field or a Heartfire Hero, if you can get its power to 7, which casting a single Turn Inside Out while you have the Leyline of Resonance out gets your dude to 7, you then sacrifice it after it deals its damage, and it deals 3 times its power. If you don't hit that, you can also win off of Plotting Slickshot Show Off on turn 2, and then on turn 3, hitting it with 2 combat tricks of the Turn Inside Out Monstrous Rage, and then sacking it to the Callous Sellsword. You need to get it to power 9 so that it does 11 damage after you cast the Fling of Burn Together. You don't really need to bring in the black mana, although it does affect the win rate slightly. There are some games where playing out the Callous Sellsword comes in handy. 1 in 100 games is all you need for a 1% increase to your win rate. So as far as the matchups go, this one is kind of why we see no Celestian Rabbits, Boros Convoke. This, especially because of how popular this deck has been. I've been facing it about 30% of my matches or so, according to the tracker. And so, certain strategies are you cannot play them unless you have an answer to this strategy. Azorius Oculus is the one that's the top performing archetype that does poorly against this archetype because it does so well against the other decks. This one does better against mono red aggro because of being able to win on a faster clock. It does well against Rakdos Lizards. It does well against Domain. It's a little bit of a coin flip, like I mentioned, with Boros Auras, depending on whether or not they have the lifelink enchantment. And it's weak to Azorius Control, Mono Black Discard, Boros Tokens, and Golgari Midrange. And basically, that's why I was saying that anything that has interaction and has the point of the deck is interaction, you're going to have ample enough stuff to remove the threats of Heartfire Hero and Slickshot Show Off. Number 4 is Mono Red Aggro, and this is a very similar strategy to the Rakdos Aggro, but instead of flinging at our opponent, we're bringing in the Shock as well as the Lightning Strike, so that we have some more interaction, which if you do have your Shock, it's going to help you up against Rakdos Aggro. You're still an unfavored matchup if you don't have the Shock, so keep that in mind. The changes, we have enough to from Bloomburrow to kind of track the changes throughout the weeks on this one as well. So compared to Bloomburrow, we've dropped the 4 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire, which is the +2/+2 and trample combat trick that can destroy an artifact after you've dealt damage, to bring the lightning strikes back up to 4. Near the end of Bloomburrow, we were exploring seeing the lightning strikes dip down, and bringing out a single mountain to bring in 3 copies of the Rockface Village. And so what we're seeing here is that, like, the base of the deck is 17 lands, and don't treat this as a land. It's a land if you need it to be, right? But the point of this is to be able to tap 1 red and play it almost as a recurring combat trick to trigger your Valiant and extend the deck further into the late game. So when you're mulliganing, you may want to consider Rockface Village not as a full land, because of its inability to cast all of your combat tricks and spells like Shock, Monstrous Rage, Lightning Strike, etc. So the deck could function on 17 or 18 lands like we're seeing in Rakdos Aggro. So I think that that's a nice way to do it, is just treat the Rockface Villages as if they're not lands. As far as the tracker data goes for the matchups, it's favored against, like, a lot of decks that are kind of not super popular, but when put together, actually create a large chunk of the meta. if you were to say, like, other represents 30% or whatever, then mono red is beating those other. As far as specific archetypes go, though, it's weak to the mono black discard, Rakdos Aggro, outside of having the Shock in hand, and Golgari midrange. Number 5, according to the tracker, is Azorius Control. And we haven't actually seen this archetype since Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And so I'm gonna kind of call this one a new archetype, although it is not a new archetype. People just kind of lost interest in it after they lost the Memory Deluge and the Wandering Emperor, and they couldn't really get it to work. Like, people are exploring, like, running Beza, and, like, basically mono white tokens control kind of became the more popular control pick, right? But at the beginning of this first week, we see the return of Azorius Control, and curiously, with no cards brought in from Bloomburrow or from, or actually, sorry, we got Spellgyre from Bloomburrow. No new cards from Duskmourn. But the strategy of this one is counter all of your opponent's plays, and then eventually grind them out with some sort of win condition, usually the Restless Anchorage, Mirrex, Hornlock Whale to an extent, and maybe a large token off of Sunfall. But this one's not running Jace, not running any form of mill win condition, and we do have the No More Lies, the 3 Steps Ahead, and the Spellgyre for counter spells, and we've seen a decrease in the Cavern of Souls because we're not seeing as many tribal decks, because the Celestia Rabbits deck is not performing very well. Rakdos Lizards is doing okay in the top 8, but it's not a super popular pick. Kind of leaves a little bit of space for Azorius Control to come back into the meta. And so we've got Elspeth's Smite, which really helps against mono red. We've got the Get Lost and Not on My Watch, which further helps that matchup. And we've got the Deduce for people who are playing the mid-range decks and are trying to play around the counter spells. You then cast Deduce instead after they've passed through their instep, so that you can then trigger a card draw, and again off of the Clue token. Temporary Lockdown works pretty well against the Auras deck, in my experience, and because most of the deck is built off of 1s and 2 drops that are being enchanted. So Temporary Lockdown works well against the Boros Auras, and Sunfall works better up against, like, Azorius Mentor, which can be a little bit problematic for the control archetype. And then we have the Hornlock Whale, which is able to bounce, and then also becomes a large threat and a win condition for the deck. So again, we're kind of early on. This one is favored against Rakdos Aggro, and that's really the reason why it's in the top 8, is because so many people are playing Rakdos Aggro. Azorius Control can kind of not pay as much attention to some of its worst matchups. Rakdos Lizards is number 6, and if we compare this one to Bloomburrow, we see that they dropped the 2 copies of the Valley Flamecaller and brought in a 4th copy of the Laughing Jasper Flint and a 4th copy of the Thoughtstalker Warlock. The Valley Flamecaller allows your lizards to ping for an additional damage, which works well with Gev and pings off of, like, the Hired Claw and the Vine Lasher. The lands also got kind of a rework, so we dropped one mud flat village as well as one rock face village. So the rock face village does better against the wraths, especially Sunfall, being able to actually get your creatures in before they get answered by your opponent's interaction. And we dropped 3 swamps to bring in 2 mountains, a restless vents, which I think is to kind of reflect maybe a little bit of the Azorius Control, being able to get it like extend a little bit later into an alternative threat that doesn't get destroyed by wraths, and one additional copy of the Sulphurous Springs. So we've seen this archetype before. It's all outlaws and lizard synergies. Being able to ping your opponent even before the creatures come into play, allow you to get the ETBs off of like Flamecash Gecko and get a really explosive start. And then we have the disruption of Cut Down and Go for the Throat, as well as Deep Cavern Bat to mess with our opponent. The Cut Down and the Go for the Throat being the good tools against mono red. And then the Thoughtstalker Warlock leaning further into hating on their opponent's hand, and is particularly nice for the more controlling matchups. As far as what the spread is on the meta, Rakdos Lizards, there's not a whole lot in yet. I could have looked up the data from last set, and I didn't, because sometimes you get a shift and an archetype starts performing differently in a matchup. So I'll keep posting it as it goes on throughout the weeks. And but right now, the toughest matchup for Rakdos Lizards is the Rakdos Aggro, outside of the Cut Down and the Go for the Throat. Number 7 is Boros Tokens, and Boros Tokens is one that we finally see, right? So last in Bloomburrow, Boros Tokens existed, but it was not showing up on any of the trackers, and I don't know why. So we finally get to see it here show up on the tracker at number 7, and so we'll treat this one as a new archetype, even though it was around in Bloomburrow. And basically, you're leaning off of the Caretaker's Talent is the key enabler for this strategy. Being able to draw a card whenever a token enters the battlefield allows you to draw a card every time that, like, Urbrask's Forge creates a token. You've got the Carrot Cake as well. You've got the Elspeth that creates tokens as well as gives you lifelink. You've got the Virtue of Loyalty, which creates a token and then gives you eventual board pumps down the road. And then you've got sweepers like the Temporary Lockdown and the Sunfall. You've got Torch the Tower and Lightning Helix, as well as Get Lost for instant speed interaction to help you against mono red. And this deck is a lot of fun to play if you haven't checked it out yet. It also performs well in best of 3 depending on the meta. We saw a spike in it near the beginning, and then it kind of dipped down in Bloomburrow. So we'll see if it makes it back into the top 3 in best of 3. I think it's very well positioned in the meta right now, partially because of how well it destroys the Rakdos Aggro deck. So you've got plenty of interaction and then further board sweepers to ensure the victory against the Rakdos Aggro. And then you also have Carrot Cake, which can help stabilize and kind of get you out of range a little bit, especially with the lifelink. And number 8 is Mono Black Discard. And if we look at the trajectory, so last week when we first got, like, Duskmourn just barely dropped, Mono Black Discard was in the top 3. And then it started to slowly fall down the list. And this morning it was number 8 when I prepared this meta review. And by this afternoon, it wasn't in the top 8 anymore. It was above a 50% win rate. But part of the reason why we see the Mono Black Discard dropping over time has to do with how many people are playing the Rakdos Aggro and the Mono Red strategies. So by the time that I got to covering the archetypes during Bloomburrow, Mono Black Discard had already fallen out of the top 8. So we're going to treat this one as a new archetype, even though it was around during Bloomburrow. And you've got Cut Down and Go for the Throat for your instant speed interaction. You've got the Hand Hate off of Bandit's Talent, Liliana, Thoughtstalker, Warlock, and Ruthless Negotiation and Hopeless Nightmare to make them discard. So if we see a rise in Azorius Control, you should be able to answer the control strategy with that much Hand Hate. We've got some stabilization with Shieldred the Apocalypse to gain some life. Wrinkle's Prank here as a one-of I really like, just to be able to further lean into the discard and controlling the board. Each player sacrificing 2 creatures can be particularly devastating. And then Tiny Bones the Pickpocket allows us to play off of the early stuff that we kill. So we kill one of their Heartfire heroes, we can then play it back with the Tiny Bones the Pickpocket. So right now, as I kind of was talking about at the beginning, this one is favored against mono red aggro. It's favored against Boros Auras, which could be useful as far as like countering the #1 performing deck, and then also favored against Rakdos Aggro. So if you're coming into, I've seen some people leaving comments that they've been playing against 70% Rakdos Aggro. They like, my opponent keeps playing a turn 1 or turn 0 Leyline of Resonance. If that's the case, and you've got 70% of your matchups going to mono red, play mono black discard, and you will not be sad. It is weak though to Azorius Oculus. It's weak to the Boros Tokens deck. It's weak to Golgari midrange. So it as people get bored of playing the turn 2 mono red deck, then we're gonna see more explorations of other archetypes. And with that, then mono black discard becomes less well positioned in the meta. So it's kind of one to keep your eye on as it spikes in and out throughout the weeks. All right, and now that we're done with the 8 best of 1 decks, let's talk about what's happening in best of 3. And we see quite a diverse best of 3 meta right now. Definitely nothing figured out, lots of exploration, and lots of different archetypes making it into the top 3 over the Standard Challenge. So the Standard Challenge is a tournament that happens on Friday, Saturday, and Sundays now. Used to just be, I think, Sundays, and it's grown in popularity. But it's a tournament on Magic the Gathering Online and has a lot of top competitors like Mogged. I'm blanking on the other names, but you'll recognize these names as we go through them, right? So first up here, we've got Gruul Aggro by L1X0, which is a familiar name. They took down first place on Friday, and this archetype did exist during Bloomborough, so we'll talk about kind of the changes to the archetype. So we've dropped 1 copy of the Callous Sellsword and 3 copies of the Manifold Mouse, and brought in 4 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, as well as 4 copies of the Emberheart Challenger. And by the way, I've crafted 4 copies of this card, and Arena still defaults into throwing this one randomly in. So I'm sorry, guys. I don't mean to do it. Arena's doing it to me. I do have 4 of these. Like, there we go. All right. So the Audacity is getting dropped. We've got the Giant Growths got dropped by 3. The Mirror and Bane Splitters got dropped. And again, that's because we're going to see the Leyline of Resonance. And we also dropped the Snakeskin Veils and the 1 copy of Tyvar's Stand to bring in 4 copies of the Shock. And I think this one is just to answer other Gruul Aggro decks. We've got the Turn Inside Out like we saw in Best of 1, and then the Leyline of Resonance. And we've also tweaked the lands a little bit. So we've dropped a Forest and 2 copies of the Restless Ridgelines. We still have 1 copy of the Manland. We're dropping the 4 copies of Thran Portal to bring in 3 mountains and the new Thornspire Verge, which I definitely think is better than the Thran Portals in this archetype where you have the Verge lands. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, I guess, yeah, the general strategy is very similar to what we see in Mono Red and Rakdos Aggro in Best of 1, which is the turn 2 combos off of the Heartfire Hero and the Cacophony Scamp, with the Turn Inside Out or Monstrous Rage plus the Fling. And then also the Slickshot Show Off, as I mentioned. And usually why you see Gruul Aggro being played instead of Mono Red Aggro and Rakdos Aggro is because you have the Snakeskin Veil. And this one's not deciding to run it in the main, but is at least has the option of it in the best of 3 sideboard. So if we compare this to what we saw in Bloomborough, Questing Druid has been dropped entirely from the list, so it's not even in the sideboard. Same with the Innkeeper's Talent, which is another one that I think is probably worth exploring, maybe. We'll see if it comes back. Torch the Tower was also dropped, which if we're seeing more of the Gruul Aggro, I think the Torch the Tower will probably make it back in. It's kind of like, do you want to play the Shocks or do you want to play the Torch the Towers? And then Rin and Realmbreaker got dropped. And we're bringing in 3 copies of the Obliterating Bolt. If you give us some exile for problematic blockers, the Paw Patch Formation for problematic enchantments, creatures with flying. It's particularly nice against Domain, where you can use this against Atraxa or up the Beanstalk. And then we've got the 2 copies of Snakeskin Veil, which you're going to bring in post post board for anticipating your opponent's single point interaction. And then we've got the 4 copies of the Urabrask's Forge, which is particularly nice if your opponent does not have the artifact hate. And then we have 1 copy of the Restless Ridgeline. And it's not uncommon to see a land in the sideboard, sometimes because when you're on the play, you need less lands. When you're on the play, you need more lands. When you're on the draw, you need less lands. So you can kind of sideboard it according to whether or not you're on the play or the draw. Second place was taken down by Azorius Convoke by Hamuda. And part of the reason why this is called Azorius Convoke is just because the name got kind of grandfathered in. And like Azorius Artifacts is already taken. Azorius Tokens is already taken. Like Azorius has got so many different builds. This kind of stuck with being called the Convoke deck. Because originally you were creating a whole bunch of tokens to make a really big Regal Bunnycorn and then also cheese your stuff out with Convoke. So this is not doing that, but it has a lot of the similar cards from back in the day that still is included in the list. So we did have this one in Bloomborough as well that took down a top 3 before. And so if we compare it to that list, we can see that they dropped 2 copies of the Mockingbird and brought in 2 copies of the Split Skin Doll, which allows us to filter. Although it's kind of like a free card draw in this deck a lot of the time, just because of how many little 1-drops you do have. So exploring that one. And then we dropped the Case of the Filched Falcon, the 3 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express, and the 2 copies of the Spring-Loaded Sawblades to bring in the 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts. Again, this card is absolutely insane. If you have not tried it out, I think the fact it's an uncommon too is fantastic. So... And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Unidentified Hovership, which was a new one that we got in Duskmourn. Flying vehicle that allows us to exile with something toughness 5 or less. And then when it leaves the battlefield, they don't get the card back. They manifest Dread instead. So kind of a cool one. Restless Anchorage got dropped by 1, and 3 planes got dropped so that we could bring in the 4 copies of the Flood Farm Verge. Again, if you're in those color pairs that have the Verge lands, I think you're going to run them. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 1 less copy of Tishana's Tidebinder, dropping the Werefox Bodyguards, and the 2 copies of Get Lost to bring in the 3 copies of Elspeth's Smite. This being really good against the Gruul Aggro, the early aggressive strategies. And then Ghost Vacuum is kind of like a new graveyard hate, recurring thing like Unlicensed Hearse that we saw before rotation. And so I think this is going to be really good for answering those Reanimator combo decks that we were starting to see at the end of Bloomborough popping up. As far as the general strategy goes, I did kind of skip over that, so just really quickly, you're flooding the board with things that create tokens like the Spyglass Siren, the Novice Inspector, which makes the Regal Bunnycorn really big. You can tap those tokens to make the Warden of the Inner Sky really big. You can then Mockingbird to copy any of your threats. Subterranean Schooner is able to make your flyer like Spyglass Siren into more of an actual threat. The Zoetic Glyph then can be used to reanimate a lot of those little tiny artifacts. And then the Steel Seraph is able to give you some life stabilization through the lifelink. You can also give flying if you need to get the damage through for lethal. And then some of the cards, I guess, that we didn't really talk about in the sideboard, just really quickly. Destroy Evil is really good against Domain. Disdainful Stroke is really good against Domain. Lauren of the Third Path is good against like Urabrask's Forge. Tishana's Tidebinder is really good against Planeswalkers, anything with an interesting ETB. And then Negate if you're up against a very spell-heavy list. And third place on Friday was taken down by 5 Color Legends by Guyote. And we saw this one before running Slogurk, before rotation, and is kind of centered off of the Relic of Legends, not entirely, but you're playing a whole bunch of legendary creatures which then can tap for mana, and it almost ends up playing like a combo deck where you can just start doing these obscene plays where you keep playing more legendary creatures which then tap and allow you to play even more legendary creatures, and then you get some fun synergies off of them, like Lasav being able to become a copy of something in your graveyard. We've got the cut down and the Go for the Throat for some interaction, and then the Tiny Bones joins up, also attacks your opponent's hand while also doing the mill and lose 1 life. And you could also mill yourself if you really want to turn on the graveyard synergies in this deck. it's kind of up to you. Like you can bring things back with the Honest Rutstein, Marchesa, then also gets you kind of that value off of committing crimes. And yeah, it's a cool list. And I'm not, I was curious to see it return because it was kind of heavily leaning on Slogurk prior to rotation. So cool to see a top 3 finish here by Guillote. So the sideboard is got a whole bunch of your typical tools, so like cut down against the early aggression for mono red, disdainful stroke and negate for domain, Lorn of the Third Path for Urbrask's Forge, virtue persistence for early interaction, and life stabilization, so good against like the Gruul Aggros, the aggro like Dimir Aggro. Duress helps against the control matchups, get rid of the Sunfalls in their hand. Bitter Triumph for some Planeswalker hate. Glistening Deluge is your answer to like Rakdos Lizards and the board floody strategies, although we're not seeing a ton of those. So we're curious to see if we actually see a decrease in the Deluges in next week, kind of going down, since we didn't see Boros Convoke or Celestine Rabbits or a whole bunch of those board floody strategies. Karavik the Punisher allows you to kind of replay your removal if you are playing against something that needs to kind of go further into the mid game. And then Hostile Investigator can attack your opponent's hand. I like it against the mid-range and control matchups. All right, on to Saturday. We got Azorius Tempo by Makubi. Took down first place. And this one, I guess Azorius Oculus is probably what I'll call it going forward, as opposed to Azorius Tempo, which I think is what MTG Goldfish was calling it. Just because like the previous list could also be called Azorius Tempo, and you'll see what I mean by like there's too many Azorius decks to all give them the right name. But anyway, let's call this one the Azorius Oculus because that's what I called it in Best of One. So this one took down first place and is running the Oculus as well as the Djinn. I think is partly why we saw the Mentor getting ditched and both of these cards being brought in the actual deck. So if we compare it to the Best of One list, I think it actually is very close to the same list. It may not be exactly, but it's got the soul partitions into the Floodmaw, the counter spells, 3 steps ahead, sleight of hands. Like I would be kind of curious to see if you put them right next to each other, just how different they are. So we kind of already talked about that one in Best of One, so I'll skip over it. As far as the sideboard goes, though, we do see so they have the Elspeth Smite for against the aggro decks. Kutzel's Flanker gives us the Graveyard Hate. It's also decent stabilization against aggro because of the gain 2 life and scry 2. Doorkeeper's Thrall is really in here for hating on the ETBs, Domain, Boros Convoke to an extent. Soul Partition helps us against the tempo decks. We're stalling until we can kind of get into our later combos. We've got the 3 negates for if we're up against control, and then we have 3 copies of the temporary lockdown if we are up against a board flooding strategy. All right, second place on Saturday was taken down by Domain by Lucas Dusek 2, and I struggle to actually call this one Domain, but the more like when you sit down and you actually look at it, you see Atraxa, you see Herd Migration, and you see Sunfalls. So like it has hints of Domain, but really what we're doing is we're leaning into the overlords that we got in Duskmourn. So we got Overlord of the Haunt Woods as well as Overlord of the Mistmoors in here, and which works nicely with Zur Eternal Schemer, where the enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof, and then target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature in addition to its other types. So if you have something that's chillin' that you did the impending for, that's just sitting as an enchantment, you could make it into a creature and then attack with it, right? So that's the whole point. It's just like enchantment synergies with the control shell of Domain. So we have Anoint with Affliction and Virtue of Persistence, which some versions of Domain back, far enough back, we're running a little bit more black. So like this one is. We have Analyze the Pollen, which allows us to search our library for lands for fixing, but also for our combo pieces. Tranquil Frillback helps with life stabilization and artifact and enchantment hate. Deshaun's Tidebinder helps with ETBs. Archangel of Wrath gives us some stabilization, which a lot of the ramp of this deck has been taken away. So I'm curious to see how quickly you can get into playing all of your top end. I would have thought that this needed to have some of the ramp that we saw in the previous domain lists. And excuse me, my throat's bothering me real quick. Let me grab some water. Yeah, it's kind of a clever build because you have a whole bunch of these little one-ofs that were in domain, are still in domain, I guess, and you got some new cards like Invasion of Tolvada we don't usually see. But then you can kind of get this like reanimation from your graveyard onto the battlefield with the Tolvada, and yeah, it's a cool list doing something new for sure. And I'm not sure that it's going to replace domain as a staple, more so than it is just kind of a one-of that kind of made it on there. But we'll see. I've been wrong in the past. So as far as the sideboard goes, we've got the Ghost Vacuum to hate on the graveyard. We've got the Negates to hate on control. Cease and Desist also gives us some graveyard hate, as well as Artifact and Enchantment hate. Tashana's Tidebinder, good for against Planeswalkers. The third and fourth copy of Archangel of Wrath, for if you are up against aggro. Rankle's Prank, I thought, was kind of an interesting one in here. I'm not sure what you would specifically be bringing this in for. Might be for against the mirror, where it's not uncommon to have like a single angel on the battlefield, and maybe can give you kind of a tipping point in the mirror match. That, if you know in the comments below, I'd love to hear what you think about the Rankle's Prank. The End also allows us to remove a key piece, so I think is probably for the mirror. Same with the Elesh Norn. Anything that's dependent on the ETBs is nice to bring in the Elesh Norn. We have the third copy of the Sunfall if we really need to bring in an additional sweeper. And then same with the Virtue of Persistence if we need additional help against the early pressure. All right, and now we've got Boros Auras by Bless Vaughn, which took down third place on Saturday. And very similar to what we saw in Best of One, but instead of running like the Discover enchantment that I'm blanking on the name of all of a sudden, we've got the Painter's Studio to give us a little bit more dig. We've got the Lightning Helix here too. So some interesting ideas that might actually translate into Best of One, but the core is relatively the same. We still have the Manifold Mouse, Ember Heart Challenger, Heartfire Hero, Slick Shot Show Off, Optimistic Scavenger, the Shard Mage Rescue, and the Sheltered by Ghosts, Monstrous Rages, and the Monastery Swift Spears. So the running more manlands, because the best of three tends to be more grindy than Best of One, and especially post board. When they bring in all of the interaction, it's nice to have a little bit more staying power in Best of Three compared to Best of One. And you also don't have the Best of One hand smoother, so which changes things a little bit, but honestly not that much, but it does change things enough. Some people really don't like it. So as far as the sideboard goes, we see a reasonably focused sideboard. So we've got 4 copies of Exercise, which allows us to attack artifact, enchantment, or creatures with power 4 or greater. And we've got Lightning Helix, so we can bring in a third and fourth copy if we're up against something that's very aggressive. The Dewdrop Cure allows us to bring back additional things from our graveyard, so not so great against Sunfall and Temporary Lockdown, but pretty good against the instant speed interaction, single point removal of black and red. Enduring Innocence is a recurring threat that also gives us some card draw every time that we're playing our little tiny creatures. We don't have the same token generation as you'll see in Azorius Enchantments, which I talked a bit in my budget builds. It didn't make it into the top 8 in week 1. It briefly did. We'll see if it makes it further down the road. But I think it was actually when Discard dropped out, I think it was number 8 when I started recording this. So hopefully we'll talk about it down the road. But basically, you're not getting as many 1/1 tokens over time that would be giving you the recurring card draw. But this sort of thing is really nice if you are up against something like Golgari Midrange, where you've got a lot of interaction to get through, and so you need to bring in some additional card draw. And then you also have the lifelink off of it, where you don't need the lifelink off of the Sheltered by Ghosts, so it could be stabilizing against early aggression as well. And then the Overlord of the Mistmoors gives us a larger threat if you need to go a little bit further down. I think also against like maybe a more aggressive, a more mid-range threat, where like Golgari midrange, kind of if it's a very grindy matchup, you'd want to bring in a little more oomph. All right, now on to Sunday's tournament, and we've got Gruul Aggro number 2 by L1X0. So if we compare it to their list that they ran on Friday, they took down 2 top 3s over the weekend, so they definitely got something figured out. If we compare this one, we see that they dropped the Calisel Swords entirely. So again, the Calisel Swords, I don't think we're actually going to see them stay around in best of 3, especially in the tournament scene, because if you put a bunch of combat tricks onto them and then go for the fling, if your opponent removes that card, you're losing multiple cards to one piece of interaction, and I think it's just too detrimental. Now, sometimes you are going to have that Snakeskin Veil to like miraculously save your dude, but not every time, right? And so it's usually a little bit too prone to the single point interaction for best of 3, and that's why we don't see the fling in best of 3. So curious to see if it comes back. We do see it popping in and out. The Manifold Mouse was also dropped, and the 4 copies of the Slickshot Show Off. So we're just leaning away from what we were seeing in best of 1 and more into the traditional sort of stuff that we see in best of 3. Picnic Ruiner gives us the Green Adventurer, gives us a little bit more grindy value in those longer games, and then if we don't have to hit it with multiple things of interaction, we can just risk it once to get its power up there permanently. To the 4 for the double strike win, and we've dropped the 1 copy of the Giant Growth to bring in the 4 copies of the Shock. So we're not trying to interact with our opponent, and instead we're going with the Might of the Meek, which we do see in best of 1, which does work well with the Leyline of Resonance for that additional card draw. We're deciding to mainboard the Snakeskin Veil, so I guess they had enough single point interaction on Friday. They felt like it was time to bring it in on Sunday. And then 3 copies of the Witch's Mark, which it gives us that additional dig. So you see this kind of card along with Questing Druid more often in best of 3 than you do in best of 1, again, because of the games being slightly longer. And then Restless Ridgeline was dropped in favor of bringing in 2 mountains. So deciding to not do the sideboarded land and just bring the land count up to 20. So the best of 3 sideboard, we dropped 1 copy of the Paw Patch formation, dropped the 2 copies of the Scorching Shot, which is the double pip red for dealing 5 damage. We moved the 2 Snakeskin Veil to the main from the board, and then we dropped the Restless Ridgeline to bring in 4 copies of Torch the Tower. So, like I was mentioning, the Shock versus Torch the Tower, I think that this is just strictly a better Shock that at least gives you the bargain option, right? So the downside to it is that you can't shoot their face, right? So if you're attacking creatures and planeswalkers, the Torch the Tower is superior. And I think that really you're bringing this in when you need to shoot a Slickshot Show Off out of the sky. So I like it as a sideboard card more than a main board card, and especially with the Leyline of Resonance, which doesn't synergize with having the instant and sorcery that doesn't target one of your creatures. So I like this change. I like the Sunday version more than the Friday version. And then we've got 2 copies of the Twisted Fealty, which allows us to take a really big, juicy threat and hit our opponent with it. All right, and here's the card. Here's the deck that I was talking about that kind of made it so that we didn't see Azorius Control in Bloomburrow. It was because of mono white token control, and so it took down 2nd place on Sunday by Taylor Spain. And if we compare this one to Bloomburrow, we do see some changes to the archetype, so we've dropped 1 copy of the Sanguine Evangelist, as well as 1 copy of the White Sun's Twilight, which is an alternative Wrath to Sunfall, and dropped 2 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty, and brought in 2 copies of the Parting Gust, and 2 more copies of Sunfall, as well as an additional copy of Archangel Elspeth. So really just a very similar strategy to what we saw in Bloomburrow. And then 1 Plains and 2 Myrics have been removed to bring in 2 copies of the Sunken Citadel, which works really well for activating the expensive activation costs of your Fountain Port. As far as the best of 3 sideboard, we also see a tweak to it as well. So they brought in an additional copy of the Boonbringer Valkyrie, as well as a 3rd copy of the Imidane's Recruiter. This card being particularly handy against Domain. And Elspeth's Smite was removed, and same with Sunder the Gateway and the Stone Brain, and Tokashia's Welcome, to bring in 1 Not on My Watch, which you just straight up exiles for 1 more than the Elspeth Smite, and then 4 copies of the Rest in Peace. So I'm not sure which deck they were trying to counter, but there must have been some form of reanimator that they were worried about bumping into to bring in the 4 copies of the Rest in Peace. All right. And deck number 17 in third place on Sunday is Azorius Convoke by Hamuda. So Hamuda and L1X0 both being able to get a top 3 on Friday as well as a top 3 on Sunday. So if we compare this to their list on Friday, they made very few changes. So they dropped the Split Skin Doll as well as 1 Zoetic Glyph to bring in 2 copies of the Shard Mage's Rescue to give us some interaction, protect our juicy threats like the Regal Bunnycorn, give us some life stabilization. Honestly, I think I would run this higher up. I've been really impressed with this card. I might tweak this one up even further. And then 1 additional copy of the unidentified hover ship. So, but you can't say that they're doing the wrong thing because they took down first place both times. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard, we see no changes to the list. So thank you for listening to my ramblings. I hope they find you well. I try to keep these episodes around 45 minutes because covering 17 decks is quite a bit of time. And, if this is something that you look forward to every week, you could always think about becoming a YouTube member, helping support the cause. I would greatly appreciate it. But obviously, it's not necessary. I'll be doing this anyway. And tomorrow, I'll be posting the community deck techs. So if you do have a deck that you want reviewed by me, we can, and by the community, kind of share our thoughts on how to improve the deck. Or if you just want to show off what cool deck you've built, some people do that too. But throughout the week, I'll try to be doing some gameplay videos. It kind of depends on how busy my schedule is going to be. And then on Sunday, I should be getting around to my first round of Meta Breakers, where we talk about mythic decks with above a 60% win rate for 50 games that are off-meta picks that somebody successfully piloted a mythic. Then we'll get that one started this Sunday. So take care, everybody. If you're new here, welcome to my community. I do one of these every Monday. And that's it. Take care. Catch you later.